when a murder is left unsolved.
You always think, have we missed something? What have we missed?
And a killer is on the loose.
To look at that individual and think he's capable of doing what he did is quite unbelievable.
He carried out the last act of absolute total control, which is murder.
Britain's cold case detectives will never give up.
What else can we do? What else should we do to serve the family who've lost a loved one?
He's obviously driven down here in the car and deposited her in the undergrowth.
That's the unanswered question, isn't it? Why? Why did he do it?
No matter how long it takes.
This was the last throw of the forensic dice.
They'll investigate every angle and uncover every clue.
That seemed to be the missing piece of the jigsaw.
Until the killer is caught at last.
One hurdle after another. We were doggedly determined to succeed.
A case like that will stay with you for the rest of your life. She was a young single girl, enjoyed life, doing what 26-year-old girls do.
We had no idea who the offender was or what the motivation was.
Every crime has a motive. It could be nanoseconds, or it could be 20, 30 years.
Soon learned that there was no quick fix to this. There was no quick answer. We kept an open mind. We didn't know.
It was the biggest murder inquiry South Wales Police have ever launched.
The public expect. They expect a resolution. They expect the police to find the killer.
Three days before Christmas, an 11-year-old boy out playing football makes a shocking discovery.
Body of office worker Geraldine was found dumped in a brook near Fairwater Leisure Centre in Cardiff.
It was a Saturday. I was off duty. My bleeper went to contact the control room in headquarters, Bridgend, which I did. And then they informed me that body had been found in a stream in Fairwater in Cardiff, and that I was required, along with many other officers, to attend. There was a big police presence. There was about 50 or 60 detectives working on it from the start. Scenes of crime, forensic officers, pathologists, all the people you'd expect to be involved in the first 24 hours were involved. It could be seen that she was partly clothed. There were some injuries apparent to the body, but one could not establish the cause of death from that. But they'd had all the hallmarks of a violent death. Fairwater was a typical suburb of Cardiff. You know, a lot of people lived there, a close-knit community. It was an area where people knew each other.
This was a significant case, so we were all called in. Everyone was called in on it. It had massive impact community-wise, massive impact for South Wales Police. It was probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, murder inquiries South Wales Police have ever launched.
The reaction for the community, you can imagine, I mean, when the body was found, police cars arrive and everybody comes out to see what's going on. There was a lot of people in the area. The leisure centre is just nearby. People going to the leisure centre, walkers walking their dog, and then the realisation that a body of a local girl in a quiet place like Fairwater has been discovered in a stream.
The young woman has already been identified.
Geraldine was a local Cardiff girl. She lived in Fairwater with her parents and her brother and sister. She worked as a shipping clerk at Cardiff Docks, a very outgoing, very well liked, just a young lady enjoying life.
It was incredible that Geraldine, we found out, lived just yards from where she met her death. You know, she could probably see her house from where she was attacked. And with the festivities just kicking in, with people just preparing to enjoy Christmas. This poor family, it's terrible. Nobody would ever think that this would have happened. There's no words to describe what must have been going through their minds. I mean, they were devastated. Their life changed on that night. They were living right on the crime scene. They were witnessing the police activity. They saw it in the newspapers. They saw it in the television. They were living their worst nightmare. Prior to removing the body, forensics would have done their work as much as they could with the body at the scene. Any blood, any body fluids. We took swabs from Geraldine's body and from her clothing. Anything that would yield evidence. It was a high-profile case, and obviously every effort was made in those 24 hours to get as much information, to gather as much evidence, and to speak to as many people as we could.
One of the challenges in the case was the fact this happened on the 22nd of December, which is a Friday, and it was a Friday before Christmas. As we all know, that's a big time for socialising, and Cardiff is like any other city. Thousands of people out in the city centre.
It was a typical night like that, where many people would have had a lot to drink. But there was nothing to suggest that she was drunk or incapable, being able to look after herself and get herself home.
The post-mortem reveals Geraldine's cause of death.
Horrendous injuries apparent. She'd been stabbed 81 times. She had received a lot of injuries to the head by a blunt instrument. Her throat had been cut. It was horrendous, to be truthful with you. It was something that I'd not experienced before.
The cause of death wasn't actually the stab wounds. The cause of death was the head injury, caused with some sort of blunt instrument. We came to the conclusion that her own high heels had been used to inflict that head injury. The attacker removed her shoes and attacked her probably while she's lying on the ground. But overriding all that was clearly a sexually motivated murder.
A lone female walking home late at night, so close to home, being attacked, raped, brutally murdered. You know, no one expects that in their area, and no one expected that in Fairwater. And, you know, it took its toll on people there, and people were anxious, frightened.
Very often in cases like this, the offender doesn't live that far away. You know, it's always a possibility the offender's living locally. So it's not just about knocking doors, it's about understanding who lives in every house in that community.
How did Geraldine live? What was her lifestyle? Who were her friends? Who did she meet that night? You know, all these unanswered questions. It all had to be put together pretty quickly.
The community of Fairwater is in shock, following the brutal murder of local girl Geraldine.
So much information came in to the incident room in that first 24 hours. We had to really prioritize. It's very important. If you find out how somebody lives, then sometimes you can understand a little bit more how they died and why they died.
On the evening of the 21st of December, Geraldine left Jackson's nightclub in Cardiff city centre around midnight.
She walked over the road to a burger bar. She bought a burger and ate it, and then went to the taxi office just around the corner to get a taxi home to Fairwater. Whilst she was in there, she came across a couple of people she knows from Fairwater, and they all agreed to share a taxi. So in that taxi, you would have had Geraldine and 3 other people, plus a taxi driver.
They would have been the last persons to have been in the company of Geraldine that we knew of on that dreadful night.
The taxi, it came up this way from the city centre, but it was turning left at Pentrabrain Road to drop other people off. So Geraldine was dropped off here to save the taxi going up there and turning back and going that way. And then she was intending on walking about 300 yards to her home address, which is just up the road there. Normally, early hours of the morning, it's unlikely this would be too busy, but because of the time of year, it was a Friday, just before Christmas, it was particularly busy. So it's quite a stream of traffic up and down this road, taxis, people on their way home from a night out. She probably would have felt perfectly safe at the time. But she carried on walking along here, and it was further along by the bank that we believe she was confronted. And we've then got a witness who was driving down this road who recalls seeing a male and a female, a man and a woman, what she thought was some sort of domestic dispute going on this bank just here. And clearly, that must have been Geraldine being confronted and probably assaulted. What corroborates that is that Geraldine's leather jacket had been pulled off, it was found in this area, it had been ripped. So it corroborates the fact that she was initially assaulted here and confronted here, and then he's forced her up onto that bank where the further attack has taken place.
We need to speak to everyone who's out and about in that crime scene or around that crime scene. That's why we had so many officers working on the investigation to try and get to them as quickly as possible.
Geraldine is not known to be in a relationship with anyone.
We were able to trace most people and most men that she would have had any form of relationship with. We had to search her house. We had to search her bedroom. We had to ask difficult questions, intrusive questions, and that's not easy. Were we missing somebody that was known to her, perhaps not known to her family, perhaps not even known to her friends, her best friends? There was evidence that prior to her death, the house, her parents' house, received a number of phone calls, and when the father answered, the phone would have been put down. Was there somebody trying to get hold of her? Was there somebody in her life that we didn't know about? Was this person her killer? Had her killer been part of her life? Was it a secret boyfriend?
Geraldine was an office clerk for a company at Cardiff Docks.
At the small shipping broker's office where Geraldine worked, staff are still in a state of shock. Her desk has remained empty, and her colleagues can't come to terms with what's happened.
She had a lot to do with merchant seamen, so we started looking at what ships were in, who was on the ships, looking at contacts she developed there through work. So there were a lot of lines of inquiry, all sorts of possibilities. When we searched the area of the playing field, it was clear that there'd been an attack there. Her belongings were strewn over quite a large area. This is a diagram that was drawn at the time by a crime scene examiner. What he was sort of confronted with, if you like, was a lot of debris right in the middle of this field here. And the debris consisted of Geraldine's belongings. A lot come from a handbag, like a purse and a lipstick, and makeup, that sort of thing. You know, here you've got like a black strap, which I think was pulled off the handbag, which shows the force that had been used. You've got some blood here, So it clearly indicated a frenzied type of struggle attack. It's clear to us that Geraldine put up a very, very brave fight. This is the stream where Geraldine was found. We know she was dragged. There were drag marks on the field leading to the stream, and in fact there were what appeared to be drag marks on her back. So clearly had dragged her over here and literally dumped her in this stream.
A forensic examination of Geraldine's body has revealed the presence of semen, providing a DNA profile that could be from her killer.
There would have been a real focus on identifying individuals that could be compared against that DNA. So that enables us to start eliminating people who were on our radar, such as people she'd been in company with, so the people in the taxi, people she'd been out with, maybe in Jackson's or in other places in the town earlier in the night, previous boyfriends. But sometimes you get to a point where there's no clear suspects.
The investigation team need to widen their search to find a match to their DNA profile.
Understand that the technology that was used at the time when Geraldine was sadly murdered was of a different type to the one we see today. We weren't able to build a DNA database with that type of technology. We needed a new technology. That's why mass screens were used as an investigative tool at the time, so to actually get individuals from the local area to come and give their sample. You had to make that direct comparison.
More than 2,500 men interviewed during the course of the inquiry will now be asked to give blood.
The mass screening wasn't something that was done routinely. They were found to be very labour-intensive. Nowadays, of course, it's taken by a buccal scrape, a swab in the mouth. In those days, it was by drawing blood. It was taking actual blood samples.
It was a simple matter on paper of matching the DNA to the offender, but clearly we have to find the offender.
Police say it's only a matter of time before they find Geraldine's killer. They expect his confidence to be shattered now that he knows he can be positively identified.
I was asked to provide a profile, psychological profile of the likely offender. No two murders are the same. There are lots of characteristics very similar, but there are differences, and it's the challenge in getting into somebody's head and working out why they've done it. Often when they don't even know themselves why they've done it. But no profile is ever going to say, this is the man. What we can say is, this is the characteristics of the likely offender. And ideally, you may end up with characteristics of maybe 50 people. It's then back onto the police to go and investigate the suspect.
The police don't rely on an offender profiler. It's part of the armoury that they take into account with all the other evidence. Now, in this case, it would have been used to help them think about focusing their intelligence-led mass DNA screen.
I wanted facts and not opinions. And I visited the site at about 1 o'clock in the morning on a Friday night. I got a taxi from my hotel and arrived at the entrance to the park. The taxi driver thought I was crazy walking into an absolutely pitch black field. And he insisted on giving me a torch so that I could find my way and not fall over. Straight away, that told me that the killer must have been somebody who knew the area and was confident enough to kill and move the body. Also, the fact that it was not on the main road tells us that it's, again, somebody with a bit more local knowledge. The killer either lives in the area, works in the area, or plays in the area.
The psychological profile helps the police to select participants for the mass DNA screening.
because it was quite an impulsive crime. It wasn't planned. He didn't kidnap her, take her to somewhere where he could then have sex with her and then kill her. It was done very spontaneously, very impulsive. Impulsivity suggests a younger male.
The DNA screening focuses on young men living in the local Cardiff area, close to Fairwater.
Police often say that it's a motiveless crime. I disagree so strongly with that. Every crime has a motive. It could be nanoseconds, or it could be 20, 30 years. There is a motive. It's somewhere in between that time period. People decide to do something or not to do something. I think quite clearly he's got a problem with women. He uses violence to have sex rather than persuasive personality. Most times people kill for anger, jealousy, money, revenge, and sex. In this case, he was killing for sex. His motive was purely sexual. I was reasonably convinced that he hadn't done it before. Had he done it before, I think he would have learnt from his mistakes. He would have made less mistakes. So again, he may have attacked somebody, but I don't think he would have killed before.
There was frustration within the team because we'd done everything possible that we could to find the killer. You know, he thought about it every day. He'd sit in the incident room, gazing up to the sky, looking for inspiration, as you do sometimes. You always think, have we missed something? What have we missed? What more could we do? The longer it goes on, the harder it gets, because witnesses will have either come forward or will have forgotten or thought, it's not worth me going in there now. There's nothing I can help them with. We came to the stage where there wasn't much more that we felt that we could do to get to the killer.
Blood samples have been taken of nearly 5,000 men in the local Cardiff area. There is no match to the DNA evidence found on Geraldine.
This was a significant case. Massive impact community-wise, massive impact for South Wales Police. This was the biggest murder inquiry South Wales Police have ever launched. To not catch a killer in these circumstances is enormously frustrating, not just for the police, but for the community, for the family. You know, we've got a duty responsibility to local people. There's still a killer out there.
There was a lot of pressure coming on the police, obviously, because quite rightly in cases like this, the public expect a resolution. They expect the police to find the killer. Nobody wanted to leave this case. We didn't want to leave this case because it was unfinished.
So you're trying to narrow it down all the time. I can't give the names of 50 suspects. What I can say is these are the characteristics. The police would then have likely suspects, but in this case, they didn't. They tried all the locals, they tried all the sex offenders, people with criminal history, violence. None of them matched either profile or matched the police impressions of what they thought the killer was.
Over the years, Geraldine's case is reviewed many times by South Wales Police, but her killer remains at large.
I don't like to use the word personal, but this sort of case does become personal, particularly if you worked on it. You know, if you're, you know, I'm local anyway. I've always worked the Cardiff area. I knew what it meant. I knew what it meant to us within the force. By that time, I was now a detective chief inspector in the major crime team. When I looked at the case again in '99, what hit me initially was the size of it. You know, the amount of paper that had been generated, the amount of lines of inquiry, statements taken, persons interviewed was tens of thousands. So to start delving into that was pointless. You weren't going to get anywhere with that. So it was clear to me at that time that the only possibility of detecting this was through the original DNA that had been taken.
The DNA that was recovered from Geraldine would have matched an individual, but of course at that time we actually didn't know who that individual might have been. Understand that the technology that was used at the time when Geraldine was sadly murdered was of a different type to the one we see today. We needed a new technology, enabling us to put some numerical values, some repeating values on the sequence, which enabled the building of the National DNA Database.
If I could get that original DNA profile onto the DNA database, I'd have some chance of possibly identifying an offender. But when I looked into it, it wasn't compatible. So I could not launch it onto the National DNA Database. So I had to explore other ways of trying to progress that. The only way of doing that would be to utilize semen that had been taken at the time that had been retained. The Forensic Science Service retain very small samples on a microscopic slide. If we could locate some of the semen that had been taken and retained, we could potentially get DNA from that.
We looked at reworking those samples, getting a profile in a numerical format that we could then launch against the database.
We had one chance and one chance only. Once they'd done their work, that would be it, and there would be nothing left. We had to make that decision, and we made the decision to go with it, and let's see what we can get. And a DNA profile was established, and that was then placed through the national database.
I did think at the time we were onto something. Unfortunately, it just didn't give us what we wanted. It wasn't enough. There was insufficient semen there to give you a profile. And the problem was, once you've used it, you can't use it again, it's destroyed. So at that stage, we had nothing.
My role had changed, and I was then the head of CID, Detective Chief Superintendent. We decided that we would review to see if there were any new lines of inquiries that emerged in the light of predominantly advances in technology, in advances in DNA. I kept close contact with the forensic scientists and Forensic Science Service, because obviously that was going to be and always going to be the best way that we could ever take this case forward.
By that time, we'd made some more advances in DNA technology. We'd become more sensitive, so we were able to get more from less.
I looked at how could I instigate DNA to be re-looked at and made compatible with the DNA database. The Forensic Science Service called Dr. Jonathan Whitaker, who was a leading light in that whole arena, made a suggestion which basically involved recovering the tubes that had been used at the time of the post-mortem. When the pathologist samples the semen from the body, he uses swabs and puts it into a bit like a test tube and seals it. He said, if you can track down those test tubes and those swabs, he said, I could subject that to another process and potentially find a DNA profile. He said, I can't guarantee it, I don't know, but it's worth a try. Eventually, we managed to track down an audit book which showed that those samples had gone off to a storage facility in Birmingham. So they were recovered, sent off to Dr. Whitaker. He applied a process to that using low copy number, to try and develop a profile, and he did, which we then launched on the DNA database the next day.
It was something that for 10 years we had not been able to resolve, and within a very short period of time, I had a phone call to say that there'd been a hit.
The DNA sample is a match to 34-year-old Mark David Hampson.
He wasn't known to us at the time in our inquiries. There was no sighting of him. He was never named. He was never named as a boyfriend, ex-boyfriend, associate, friend. This was a guy that was totally come out of the blue.
Mark Hampson's DNA is on the system as he is currently serving a 4-year prison term.
He actually attacked a 40-year-old man in a pool hall and ended up in prison for grievous bodily harm. And he apparently told the victim that he was going to kill him and made a pretty good attempt at doing so.
He was in prison in Dartmoor, but he was due to be released the following week. This was a potential killer being released back into the community. Were we prepared to allow that to happen? We came to the conclusion that, he couldn't be allowed to go back into the community, so we decided to arrest him as he walked out of Dartmoor. This is Fairwater Police Station. I can distinctly remember being stood right here on this corner with Chief Superintendent Wyn Phillips, and the convoy come along here, blue lights.
A motorcycle outrider led the 3-car convoy that brought Mark Hampson the 130 miles to Fairwater Police Station in Cardiff.
Turned in here quite fast, through the gates, and the gates shut behind him.
The 34-year-old had been arrested at Dartmoor Prison by detectives from the murder inquiry team.
So he was detained here for a couple of days, and he would have been interviewed here and charged here and would have spent his period in police detention in this police station. And this was 11 years after the crime. It was a tremendous feeling of satisfaction, I guess, to see Hampson being brought in. Great relief.
At the time of Geraldine's murder, carpet fitter Mark Hampson lived in Taff's Well, a village just outside the parameters of the mass DNA screening.
Don't remember forming any particular opinion of Hampson. I probably never do in these cases. It's not a good idea to form my own impressions anyway, but I've become quite dispassionate about an individual until we fully investigate in it, and that's the best way to be. But I would certainly, I think the bristles on the back of my neck were standing up a little bit.
Mark Hampson is questioned about how his DNA came to be found on Geraldine's body.
Hampson's account was that, yes, that's my DNA. I did have contact with Geraldine that night.
Hampson had said he'd been out that night and had walked from another part of the area, I'm sure it was Ely, and had been walking past the scene, and that's when he came across Geraldine.
He saw Geraldine get out of the taxi. He says he recognised her as somebody he'd seen a couple of weeks before in Jackson's nightclub, and he says that she willingly went with him onto the field, engaged in sexual contact. She was a willing partner in that. And he says that when he left her after that, she was still alive and has no idea how she met her death.
"34-year-old carpet fitter Mark Hampson is detained in police custody, charged with Geraldine's murder. He maintains his innocence.
I was instructed for the prosecution shortly after the case was brought before the Crown Court, after the arrest of Mark Hampson. It's very unusual that a suspect will admit being with the victim so quickly. Generally speaking, people asked about something that they did 10 years earlier will deny it, and deny it in a wholehearted way. And what the police were frankly expecting was that he would stonewall, that he would say, I had nothing to do with it, I don't know anything about it. But to their astonishment, and I use that word advisedly, he was very open, immediately admitting that he had been with Geraldine and had had sexual intercourse with her.
On the night of the murder, Geraldine left Jackson's nightclub in Cardiff around midnight.
She went to the Wimpy bar and consumed a burger. She was arriving in Fairwater by 10 to 1 in the morning. Now, when the post-mortem was conducted, her stomach contents were analysed, and they were able to say that that burger had been consumed probably between 1 and 2 hours before her death. So if you use 2 hours as the outside, we know she was consuming that burger around 12, half 12. So she's undoubtedly not alive by about 2:30 a.m. She got out of that taxi at 10 to 1 in the morning. And Mark Hampson would have you believe that in that time frame, he's met her, had sex with her and left her, and somebody else has come along and killed her. You know, it's a ridiculous notion to think that's happened.
During the course of his interviews, he didn't give very much detail, and the detail that he did give changed over the course of the interviews. But not so significantly in that he was admitting that he had been with her, and therefore saying that any DNA material had a rational explanation.
He did a pretty good job over 10 or more years to conceal that he actually did what he did.
One of the things I often argue about is how somebody behaves. Most people, if they kill somebody, are traumatized by what they've done and will often end up drinking a lot more, end up getting aroused with partners, things like that. They have a post-incident stress, and that's an indication, again, in terms of police interviewing. Somebody who's very stressed is going to behave differently from somebody who isn't stressed. The problem is, after a period of time, the killer gets to accommodate the stress and doesn't worry about it anymore.
Eventually, we did identify that he'd had connections in Ely, another suburb of Cardiff which borders Fairwater. And it became apparent that on the night in question, he'd been in Ely visiting friends, and he'd walked from Ely through Fairwater towards Taftswell, where he lived, and it would have taken him past where Geraldine got out of the taxi. There is a shortcut then, which is a disused train tunnel, which we believed he used as a shortcut back over to Taftswell, which would have shortened his journey. So what we had is somebody who was quite literally passing through late at night, unfortunately at the same time as Geraldine got out of the taxi.
You can never get into the mind of a murderer. Obviously, he was a violent man. You've got to be violent to do that. He was a desperate individual. He was desperate for sex that night. He saw this as an opportunity. He saw a lone, 26-year-old, attractive young woman. I suspect he may have, at knife point, forced her onto the playing fields, forced her into sexual contact. She put up a fight. She obviously wouldn't win it. He then became very, very angry, very violent. He decided that he had to kill her at the end. If he'd have left her alive, she would have reported, and he could have been arrested and charged with the sexual offences. He made a determined effort to remove the body to a stream nearby and took all her dignity away, left her in water for whoever to find.
Mark Hampson stands trial at Bristol Crown Court, charged with Geraldine's murder. He pleads not guilty.
The case involved a murder which took place in South Wales Police area, specifically close to Cardiff itself, and so was committed to Cardiff Crown Court. The problem there was that the arrest of Hampson coming out of Dartmoor had been headline news, and the defence were rightly concerned that a Cardiff jury might have been aware of the defendant's background, knowing that he was a criminal before they even set foot in the jury box. The defence therefore made an application for the case to be moved, and it was moved. It was moved to Bristol. I've always viewed the opening of a case, especially a serious case, as an important part of the case. And the way that I did it was to tell the jury what I'm going to tell them, and then tell them what I've told them. It was going to be a challenging case because there was DNA material, but an apparently innocent explanation for how it got there.
Nobody knows which way the jury will go, how they'll consider, whether they felt that his defence was plausible.
The trial had run for almost exactly 3 weeks by the time the jury began their deliberations. There is never any way of knowing how long a jury will be. Conscientious juries sometimes want to analyse the evidence in detail, and it seems that that's what they did in this case, because they were in retirement for over 2 days.
We knew that the DNA evidence was powerful, very, very powerful, and it was whether or not the jury would accept his version of events, which were probably the most unlikeliest of events, and they didn't. When the verdict was reached, it was unanimous, and there was a sense of relief, a sense of satisfaction. 12 years later, the individual will now suffer the consequences of the horrendous murder he inflicted.
He went to Wakefield Prison eventually, which was a Cat A prison. And he died in 2007 whilst in prison of cancer. So he only served 5 years of his life sentence. This was the biggest and most impactful investigation I've ever been involved in. People talk to me today about this case, and it never seems to be forgotten. So, yeah, a really significant case for me. This is a person who escaped justice for a long time. I knew what the impact was on the family, and I knew how they'd react. I knew what it would have meant to them. Fortunately, by that time, Geraldine's parents had passed away, so that was very sad.
Those left behind have to pick up the pieces and never do. And sometimes we spend more time worrying about the perpetrator than what we do considering the family and the victim.